The sun was bleeding out over the New Mexico horizon, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold. Down in the canyon, where the shadows grew long and secrets lay buried, the redstone walls held the day's heat like dying embers. The world was going quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat. That's where Eli Black moved, silent as smoke through the brush. He was tracking a mule deer, a big one, wounded and desperate. The trail was easy to follow, marked by stumbling hoof prints and splashes of dark blood drying in the sand. Meat was getting low in the smokehouse, and winter was coming with teeth. This wasn't a sport, it was survival. But then the trail took a hard turn toward Cottonbrush Creek, and Eli saw something that made him stop cold, something that wasn't left by any deer. Footprints, small, bare, and unsteady. Someone had passed through here, stumbling, bleeding, and running from something awful. Eli crouched low, his hand hovering over the worn leather grip of the revolver at his hip. The prints were fresh, less than half a day old. He followed them, leaving the deer's trail behind, his hunter's focus now locked on a new kind of prey, or maybe a victim. The creek bed curved, opening into a small clearing shaded by willow trees, a place where the sun gave up. And that's when he saw her. At first, he was sure she was dead. She was crumpled in the mud like a discarded doll, her dress torn to ribbons and stained with a horrifying mix of blood and dirt. Her feet were raw, blistered messes, the soles blackened and split open. Her hair, a tangled mat of gold and grime, hid her face. He stayed back, watching, waiting. The buzzards hadn't found her yet. The coyotes hadn't caught her scent. That meant she hadn't been here long, and it meant she might still be alive. He took a slow step forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Then another. He knelt beside her, his movements careful, deliberate. Her breathing was a shallow, almost invisible flutter in her chest. Her lips were cracked and pale. This woman was at the very edge of the world, about to fall off. He uncorked his canteen, pouring a little water into the metal cap. He leaned in close. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "You still with us?" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, and Eli's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were green. Not just green, but the fierce, wild green of sage after a spring rain. They were full of a fire he hadn't expected, and they were full of pure, animal terror. The second their eyes met, she jolted. She tried to scramble backward, a raw cry tearing from her throat as she clutched the tattered front of her dress with both fists, pulling it tight against her chest. Her body was shaking, not from cold, but from a fear so deep it had taken root in her bones. Then came the whisper, a broken, pleading sound that was more terrifying than any scream. "Don't untie my dress." 4 words, not a demand, but a prayer. A prayer she had clearly spoken before, each time carrying the weight of a fresh bruise, a new horror. Eli froze, his hand still holding the water. He hadn't moved to touch her, hadn't even thought of it, but her fear was so real, so powerful, it felt like a physical blow. "I won't," he said, keeping his voice steady, calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." She just stared at him, her wild green eyes unblinking, her arms locked across her chest like a shield. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, her strength gave out, and she sagged back into the mud, but her grip on her dress never loosened. She didn't look away. "I have water," Eli said again, holding out the cap. "I'll just set it here." He placed it on a flat rock, well within her reach, and then he did something that probably saved her life. He backed away. He gave her space. He showed her he wasn't a threat. She watched him like a hawk watches a snake, every muscle tensed. After a long minute, her trembling hand snaked out, snatched the cap, and she drank. Just a few sips, just enough to wet her throat. Eli kept his distance as the last of the light died behind the canyon ridge. He gathered dead wood, built a small fire in the shelter of some rocks, close enough to give warmth, but far enough not to feel like a cage. Every crackle of the flames made her flinch. When he boiled water for tea, crushing wild mint and willow bark into the pot, she turned her face away as if the steam itself might burn her. He offered her the bitter, healing tea in a tin cup. She took it with both hands, her fingers shaking, and drank it down slow. "Name's Eli," he said into the darkness, his voice quiet. "Eli Black." She said nothing. "I live north of here, not far." Still nothing. The silence was her only defense. "You got a name?" he asked, his tone gentle. A long, heavy pause. Then a voice so quiet it was almost stolen by the wind. "Ada," he nodded. "All right, Ada, that's a good name." She offered nothing else. No last name, no hometown, no story of how she ended up broken in a creek bed. And Eli didn't ask. Some stories you had to earn the right to hear. That night, they shared the silence. Eli slept by the fire, his hand near his gun, his hat pulled low over his face. Ada lay curled under his spare blanket, her back to the flames, every muscle in her body pulled tight as a wire. He heard her stir throughout the night, heard the muffled whimpers, the sharp gasps as nightmares chased her through the dark. But in the morning, she was still there, still alive, and still clutching the front of her dress as if it was the only thing holding her together. He made some rice, softened with river water and a pinch of salt. She ate a few bites, her eyes never leaving his face. She watched his hands, his mouth, his eyes, looking for any sign of the monster she was so clearly running from. "You got people out there?" he asked, trying to break the tension. Ada shook her head. "Somebody must be missing you." Another shake, then softer than a whisper. "No one." The finality in her voice sent a chill down Eli's spine. Later that morning, he hitched his mule to a small cart, loading his gear. When he turned back, Ada was sitting up, her gaze a little clearer, a little more present. The terror was still there, but it was banked, like embers glowing under ash. "I have a place," he said. 2 miles north. It has a roof, firewood. You'll be safer there, if you're willing." She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, at the mule, at the endless, rugged canyon around them. Then, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. He helped her to her feet, offering his arm for balance. She didn't take it, but she followed him. The ride was rough, the cart groaning over every rock and rut. Ada sat stiff as a board, wrapped in the blanket, her hands hidden beneath it. But about halfway there, she turned her head and looked straight at him. Her voice was quiet, but it was as firm as the stone walls around them. "I'm not weak," she said. "Just tired." Eli looked at the trail ahead, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Ain't the same thing." When his homestead finally came into view, a small, squat adobe cabin tucked between juniper trees and ancient boulders, with a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney, Ada said nothing. But he saw her hands, hidden under the blanket, loosen their death grip just a fraction. And for the first time since he found her, Eli thought that maybe, just maybe, this woman wasn't planning on disappearing. Maybe she was planning on fighting back. But as they drew closer, he saw something near the porch that made his blood run cold. A single discarded playing card, lying face up in the dust. The Queen of Spades. A card of bad luck. A warning. And it hadn't been there when he left that morning. Eli's hand went to his revolver, his eyes scanning the tree line, the windows of the cabin, every shadow. He had been so focused on Ada, he'd let his guard down. A mistake a man like him couldn't afford to make. "Stay in the cart," he said, his voice low and hard. He swung down, moving with a predator's grace, his boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He circled the cabin, his gun drawn, checking every angle. Nothing. No broken windows, no footprints other than his own. The place was as silent and empty as he'd left it. He walked back to the front porch, his gaze fixed on the card. He knelt, but didn't touch it. It was clean, crisp, not something that had been lying in the dirt for long. This was a message, a calling card. He looked back at Ada, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He forced a calm he didn't feel. Just an old card. Wind must have blown it here. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The air was dead still. He helped her down from the cart, his body now a shield between her and the unseen threat. He opened the cabin door, pushing it wide and stepping aside, letting her enter first, while he scanned the wilderness one last time. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room, a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a cot along the far wall. A rifle hung over the hearth next to a horseshoe nailed to the board. The fire he'd set that morning was now just smoldering coals. He stoked it back to life, the new flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the adobe walls. "You take the cot," he said, gesturing to the small bed. "I'll take the floor." Ada didn't argue. She moved across the room and sat down heavily, as if the simple act of standing was a battle she was losing. Eli ladled some hot stew from a pot that had been simmering over the low coals. Beans, salt pork, squash. It was simple food for a complicated moment. She took the bowl without a word, eating slowly, deliberately. Each spoonful seemed to be an act of defiance. Eli sat in the chair opposite her, not watching her directly. He knew what it felt like to be watched while you were at your most vulnerable. It felt like being in a cage. They ate in a thick, heavy silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. "Your place is quiet," she finally said, her voice barely audible. He nodded. "I like it that way." "No wife?" The question hung in the air. Eli's jaw tightened. "No more." Her eyes flickered to the quilt folded at the foot of her cot. It was a beautiful, intricate thing, made with a patient hand. "She make that?" "She did." "She must have been patient," Ada murmured, tracing the stitched patterns with her eyes. A sad, faint smile touched Eli's lips. "She was. And tough. Took the flu and childbirth both without a single complaint." His voice grew quiet. "The second one took her." Ada didn't offer sympathy. She knew, better than most, that empty words were useless. Instead, she asked a simple, direct question. "Did you bury her here?" "Out past the pecan trees. There's a cross made of river stone." The silence returned, but it had changed. It was less of an empty space and more of a shared one. "Your name?" "Black," she said, looking up from her stew. "Is that yours?" "It's the one I carry, but not the one you were born with." It wasn't a question. He set his bowl down, studying her face in the firelight. Her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion and fear, held a sharp intelligence. She saw things. "My mother," he said, his voice low, "called me Nashan. In the Chiricahua tongue it means ash after fire." Ada's brow furrowed. Ash, not the fire itself. "What's left behind," he confirmed. "That's what stays." Her green eyes held his, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. "It fits," she said. Later, while she rested on the cot, wrapped in the quilt his wife had made, Eli stepped outside. The Queen of Spades was gone. He searched the ground, kicking at the dust, but it had vanished. He hadn't heard a thing. No footsteps, no horse, nothing. Whoever was out there moved like a ghost, and they were toying with him. He grabbed his axe and started chopping kindling, the rhythmic thud of the blade splitting wood a welcome distraction from the coiling tension in his gut. He'd taken in strays before, lost riders, prospectors down on their luck. But this was different. Ada wasn't just lost. She'd been hunted. She'd been broken. And whoever did it was now circling his home like a vulture. When he went back inside, she was sitting up, reading a farmer's almanac with an intensity that suggested it held all the world's secrets. "You can read," he stated, more than asked. "I was a school teacher," she replied, her voice flat. "Back when I had a name." You still have one." She didn't reply. Instead, she looked at the rifle over the hearth. "You expect trouble." "I expect the sun to rise," Eli said, avoiding the question. "Everything else is a possibility." He pulled out a worn deck of cards from a wooden box and began to shuffle them. He set them on the table and started laying out a game of solitaire. The soft slap of the cards was the only sound. "Do you believe people can come back?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp. "Come back from what?" "From what's been done to them," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "From what they've done to survive." Eli didn't look up from his cards. He placed a red 7 on a black 8. "I think some folks spend so much time trying to get back to who they were, they forget they're still here, still alive." Ada looked down at her hands. The bruises were starting to fade, turning a sickly yellow-green at the edges. Her nails were broken, one finger bent at an unnatural angle. Survival wasn't pretty. It left scars, inside and out. "I used to be Ada Rose Halley," she said quietly, as if speaking of a dead person. "From Missouri. My father was a preacher. Is that still you?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, a slow, mournful movement. "I don't know who I am anymore." He dealt another hand, the silence stretching between them. Then she spoke again, her voice tight with a pain she could no longer hold inside. "I was supposed to marry a man, Paul. He had a farm, promised me a garden full of daisies." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I packed one bag and followed him west. 4 days into the journey, he traded me." Eli's hands stilled over the cards. "He what?" "He traded me," she repeated, her voice dead. "For 2 mules and a barrel of whiskey. He said it was just for a little while, that he'd win me back in a card game. He told me I should be grateful someone else even wanted me." The fire snapped, spitting an ember onto the hearth. Eli watched it glow, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. "He never came back for me," she whispered. Eli said nothing. There was nothing to say. Words were useless against that kind of betrayal. "They marked us," Ada continued, her voice gaining a hard, brittle edge. "The man he sold me to. He and his men. They burned symbols onto our backs, brands, so everyone would know who we belonged to, so we'd never forget." Her hand instinctively went to the collar of her dress, pulling it tighter. "Some of the other girls," she said, her eyes distant. "They tried to run. They didn't get far." "But you did," Eli said, his voice a low growl. She looked at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know if I made it out, or if I just haven't died yet." "You made it out," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "I still wake up," she confessed, her voice cracking, "feeling like my body doesn't belong to me, like someone else still owns it." Eli met her gaze, his own eyes dark with a shared understanding of loss and violation. "You ain't property," he said, his voice like iron. "Not here, not ever again." A long silence fell between them. Then she pushed back from the table. "I don't know how to be that girl again, the one who liked daisies." "Then be someone new," he said simply. She looked at him, a flash of her old fire returning. "You think it's that easy?" "No," he said, his voice softening, "but nothing worth doing ever is." That night, she took the cot without being told. As Eli laid out his bedroll by the fire, she spoke his Apache name, her voice soft in the darkness. "Nashan?" He looked over. "Yeah? Thank you." He gave a single, sharp nod. "You're welcome, Ada Rose." And for the first time since she'd woken up in a muddy creek bed, Ada Rose Halley closed her eyes and truly slept. But outside, in the deep, impenetrable darkness of the canyon, something watched the cabin. Something patient, something that knew all about the brand on her back, and it was waiting. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. It was the rhythm of healing, slow and unsteady, like a broken bone knitting itself back together. There was mostly silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty or heavy. It was the silence of shared space, of two wounded animals learning they didn't have to bite. Ada started moving more. She swept the cabin floor each morning. She wiped the table after they ate. She did these small things without asking, without expecting thanks. It was her way of building a new life, one small, solid brick at a time. She was claiming this space, and in doing so, she was reclaiming herself. Eli gave her room. He mended a fence, patched the roof on the shed, and rode out every few days to check his trap lines. Each time he went to Dry Rock, the nearest settlement, he'd return with flour and salt, and always something small for her. A spool of thread, a bar of soap that smelled of lavender, a bag of hard candy. She never thanked him with words, but he'd see the thread being used to mend her tattered dress. He'd smell the lavender on the towel she used. The candy would disappear one by one from the jar on the shelf. It was a silent conversation, a language of small kindnesses. One morning, with a cold fog clinging to the canyon floor, he found her standing on the porch, staring east toward the rising sun. "Cold?" he asked, stepping up beside her. "I don't think I feel it much anymore," she said, her voice distant. "My bones remember worse." They stood there for a long moment, watching the world wake up. "You sleeping better?" he finally asked. "A little," she admitted. "No dreams?" She hesitated. "I still hear keys," she confessed. "The jingle of keys on a ring, and chains, but it's softer now, like an echo." He nodded, understanding completely. Echoes fade. Later that day, she watched him work in his forge, the small shed where he shaped metal with fire and a hammer. He worked with his shirt off, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving with a fluid power. Sweat dripped down his spine, and the smoke from the coals curled around him like a living thing. He noticed her watching, but didn't stop. He pulled a glowing, red-hot horseshoe from the fire. "A fire is only as cruel as the hands that use it," he said, his eyes fixed on the burning metal. She took a step closer, mesmerized by the dance of flame and steel. "Were you always a blacksmith?" "No," he said, placing the shoe on the anvil and beginning to hammer, the ringing sound echoing through the canyon. "Learned it after I left the orphanage. Figured if I could learn to shape something hard and unyielding with heat and force, maybe I could learn how to shape myself." That evening, as they sat on the porch, Ada asked the question that had been hanging between them since she arrived. "Why did you never leave this place, this canyon?" Eli took a long draw from his pipe, the smoke curling up into the starry sky. "Because I got tired of running." "From what?" "From ghosts," he said simply. "From trying to belong somewhere I didn't fit. To the white man, I was too much Apache. To the Apache, I was too much white. Here," he gestured to the vast, silent canyon, "the rocks don't care what blood you have." Later that night, he heard her tossing and turning on the cot. A small, choked sob escaped her lips, a sound she tried to swallow but couldn't. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. "Eli?" Her voice cut through the darkness, trembling. He sat up. "I'm here. I can't sleep." He rose and walked to her cot, moving slowly so as not to startle her. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he could see her eyes were wide and shimmering with tears. "I remember a girl," she whispered, her voice raw. I think she was me. She liked poetry and buttered biscuits. She used to press wildflowers in books. She had a dog named Jack." "She sounds kind," Eli said, his voice gentle. "She was," Ada whispered, a tear finally tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "But she's gone. They killed her." He knelt beside the cot, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the room. "Maybe she's not gone. Maybe she's just been quiet for a while, waiting. She turned her head on the pillow, looking at him. Do you really think someone can come back from that far away? I think sometimes we don't come back to the same place we left, he said carefully. But we come forward, a little stronger, a little more real. Her hand reached out from under the blanket, her fingers brushing against his. It wasn't a plea for comfort, but a simple, human need for connection. A fragile truce between two scarred and lonely souls. He didn't pull away. He just let her hand rest there. When morning came, she didn't flinch when the sunlight hit her face. It was a small change, but it was a start. But the peace was fragile, and they both knew it. A few days later, Ada was in the small garden patch behind the cabin, pulling weeds. She was humming a small, tuneless melody. It was the first time he'd heard anything like a song from her. Suddenly, she froze. It was the same stillness he'd seen at the creek, the stillness of pure shock. The small basket of herbs she was carrying dropped from her fingers, scattering mint leaves in the dirt. Eli was at her side in an instant. What is it? Ada, what's wrong? She didn't speak. She just pointed a trembling finger at the ground near the base of a large boulder. Half buried in the loose soil, something made of dark, rusted metal glinted in the sun. Eli knelt, brushing the dirt away. It was an iron cuff, an ankle shackle, the kind used for prisoners, or slaves. A broken link of chain was still attached to it. Ada turned away, a choked gasp escaping her lips. I know that, she whispered, her voice shaking violently. That was from the first camp, the one Paul sold me to. Are you sure? They put them on our ankles, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush of remembered horror. To keep us from running, sometimes on our wrists if you fought back. They wanted to make an example of you. Eli stared at the cuff, a cold, hard anger building in his chest. He looked around. They buried it here? No, she breathed. They dropped it. There was a girl, May. She tried to run the same night I did. She broke her chain, made it this far. To this rock. Ada's voice broke. They caught her here. I was hiding in the brush. I heard it. I heard her scream for help. Eli's jaw clenched so tight he felt his teeth grind. His hands balled into fists. She never came back to the camp, Ada whispered, tears now streaming down her face. I hoped she'd gotten away somehow. But seeing this... She knelt, her hand hovering over the disturbed earth. They killed her, didn't they? They killed her and left her right here. Eli didn't have to answer. The canyon held its secrets. But this one, it had finally given up. This small patch of earth was a grave. He stood up, walked to the creek bed, and returned with a flat, smooth river stone. He laid it next to the cuff, then another and another, building a small, simple cairn over the spot, a makeshift headstone for a girl named May who had died fighting for her freedom. Ada watched him, then joined in, her small, bruised hands carefully placing stones alongside his. When they were finished, they stood over the small monument in silence. She used to sing, Ada said softly. Badly. Off-key. On purpose. Just to annoy the guards. She said if she had to suffer, they were going to suffer right along with her. Sounds like someone worth remembering, Eli said. That night, Ada didn't read the almanac. She took out an old ledger book of Eli's late wife's and a small pencil. She began to write. Not numbers or lists, but words. Sentences. She was writing down May's story. She was writing down her own. I have to remember, she told him, her eyes fierce, before someone else tries to write the story for me. Later, as they sat on the porch, she asked him a question, her voice steady and clear. Did you ever kill a man, Eli? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because he came for someone I loved. She looked at him, her green eyes searching his face in the moonlight. Would you do it again? If I had to, he said, his voice a low growl. She nodded slowly. I think they'll come looking for me, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. They don't like to lose their property. She spat the last word like poison. They called us their dogs, said even a runaway dog finds its way back home eventually. You're not a dog, Ada Rose. No, she said, a new strength in her voice. Not anymore. She placed her hand on his, her touch firm. If they do come, Eli, I won't run. I won't hide, and I won't let them take you from me. The next morning, Eli rode for Dry Rock. Before he left, he cleaned and loaded his rifle and left it leaning by the cabin door. Ada stood on the porch, watching him saddle the mule. She wasn't the same woman he'd found by the creek. The fear was still there, but now it was forged into something else. Something hard and sharp. Resolve. If I'm not here when you get back, she started. You will be, he cut her off. And if you're not, I'll find you. Dry Rock was buzzing with more life than usual. Eli kept his hat pulled low, his ears open. And then he saw it, tacked to the board outside the general store. A bounty poster. It had a crude drawing of a woman with blonde hair, $100 for the return of a runaway girl. Last seen near the southern ridge. The poster described her as mentally confused and prone to fits of fancy. They weren't just hunting her. They were trying to erase her, to turn her into a crazy woman whose story no one would ever believe. As he was reading, a man stepped up beside him. He was dressed in clean boots and a long gray duster, despite the heat. He had cold, dead eyes that scanned everything and saw everything. This wasn't some local ranch hand trying to earn $100. This was a professional, a tracker. You know her? The man asked, his voice smooth as polished stone. Never seen her, Eli grunted, turning away. But it was too late. He'd looked at the poster for a second too long. The tracker's cold eyes narrowed, just for an instant. He knew Eli was lying. Eli bought his supplies, his mind racing. He needed to get a message out. He went to the telegraph office and sent a coded wire to an old friend in Santa Fe, a man who owed him a dangerous favor. The message was simple. Need eyes south of Cotton Brush. Quiet. Fast. When he got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. The rifle was still by the door, untouched, but something was wrong. The air was too still. The usual bird song was absent. He pushed the door open, his hand on his gun. Ada was sitting at the table, but she wasn't alone. The tracker in the gray duster was sitting opposite her, a cup of coffee in his hand, and a smug, predatory smile on his face. And on the table between them lay a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Took you long enough, the tracker said, his smile widening. We were just getting acquainted. Eli's world narrowed to the space between him and the man at his table. He saw the man's hand resting casually on the tablecloth, just inches from a holstered pistol. He saw Ada, her face pale but her expression defiant, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. He saw the rifle, still leaning against the wall by the door, a lifetime away. Get out of my house, Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The tracker chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Now this ain't your house anymore. Not really. See, the man I work for, Mr. Corbin, he owns things. Land, property, people, and he's come to collect what's his. He gestured with his coffee cup toward Ada. She has a brand on her back that says so. Ada flinched, but her eyes, when she looked at Eli, were blazing with fire. Don't listen to him, she said, her voice shaking but strong. Mr. Corbin is a reasonable man, the tracker continued, ignoring her. He's willing to overlook the trouble you've caused. All you have to do is walk away. Forget you ever saw her. Let us take her home. This is her home, Eli growled. The tracker sighed, setting his cup down. I was afraid you'd be difficult. His eyes flickered toward the door behind Eli. You should know, you're a bit outnumbered. Eli didn't need to turn around. He heard the subtle creak of leather, the soft cocking of a hammer. He was caught in a trap. "What do you want?" Eli asked, stalling for time, his mind racing, searching for any possible move, any advantage. "I told you," the tracker said. "We want the girl." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I'll tell you what, I'm feeling generous. You seem like a capable man. Mr. Corbin is always looking for capable men. There's a place for you in our organization, a handsome salary. All you have to do is help us convince her to be cooperative." He wanted Eli to join them, to become one of the monsters that had broken Ada. The insult was so profound, so vile, that for a second Eli was stunned into silence. And in that second of silence, everything happened at once. Ada let out a furious scream and launched herself across the table, not at the tracker, but at the oil lamp burning in the center. She smashed it against the wooden surface and flames erupted, spreading instantly across the dry wood and the spilled oil. The tracker jumped back, cursing, momentarily blinded by the flash of fire. It was the opening Eli needed. He dove to the side, rolling behind the heavy wooden table as a gunshot exploded from the doorway, the bullet thudding into the wall where he'd been standing. He came up with his revolver in his hand, firing twice at the shadow in the doorway. A man screamed and fell. The cabin was filled with smoke and fire. The tracker was shouting orders. Ada was already at the back window, smashing the glass with a heavy iron skillet. "Go, now!" Eli yelled, providing cover fire, shooting at the muzzle flashes from outside. Ada scrambled through the broken window and disappeared into the darkness. Eli fired his last 2 shots, then turned and followed her, diving through the window just as the front door burst open and more men poured into the burning cabin. He landed hard, rolling to his feet. Ada was already untying the mule. Gunshots whizzed past their heads, splintering the wooden posts of the porch. They scrambled onto the mule together, Eli in front, Ada clinging to his waist, and kicked the animal into a frantic gallop. They plunged into the darkness of the canyon, the orange glow of their burning home lighting their path for a few desperate moments before the shadows swallowed them whole. The sounds of shouting and gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the pounding of the mule's hooves and the ragged sound of their own breathing. They rode hard for hours, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. They were alive. They were free. But they were running, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a pack of ruthless hunters on their trail. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and pink, Eli finally slowed the exhausted mule. They were deep in the labyrinthine canyons now, in a place he knew like the back of his own hand. "We have to hide," he said, his voice hoarse. "They'll track the mule." Ada slid off the animal's back, her legs shaky. She looked back the way they had come. "They burned it," she whispered. "Everything." "It was just a building," Eli said, his voice grim. "We're still alive." He led her on foot, forcing the mule through a narrow crevice between 2 towering rock formations that looked like a dead end. But Eli knew better. Inside, the crevice opened up into a hidden, shaded hollow, a small natural cave he'd discovered years ago. A small spring trickled from the rock wall, and a stash of firewood and dried goods he'd hidden long ago was still there, tucked under a weathered tarp. It was his emergency hideout, a place he'd hoped he would never have to use. Ada collapsed onto the sandy floor of the cave, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion and terror of the night. "It feels like a chapel," she murmured, looking up at the high stone walls that enclosed them. Eli managed a weak smile. A place of confession, maybe. They spent the day in the hidden cave, the silence broken only by the drip of the spring. Eli cleaned his revolver, his movements economical and precise. Ada took out the small ledger and pencil she had managed to grab before they fled. She started writing, her hand moving furiously across the page. As dusk fell, Eli scaled the rocks above the cave, using a small spyglass to scan the landscape. And then he saw them. Far in the distance, he could see a group of riders, 4 of them, moving slowly, methodically. The tracker in the gray duster was leading them. They had found the mule's trail. They were coming. He slid back down into the cave, his face a grim mask. "They're coming," Ada said, not asking, but stating a fact. She had already packed their few supplies. "Soon," he confirmed. "Do we run again?" Eli looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw the steel that had been forged in the fire of her ordeal. "We hold here tonight," he said. "Then, before dawn, we move south, fast and hard. There's a man I know in Silver Ridge. He can get us papers, passage on a train heading east." "We?" she asked softly. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "If you die for me, Eli Black, I swear I'll find a way to kill you again." A real, genuine chuckle escaped his lips. "That's fair." They didn't sleep that night. They sat by a small, smokeless fire, the rifle across Eli's lap. "I used to think I was broken," Ada said, her voice quiet but clear. "That what they did to me, what they turned me into, had made me less than human." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "But they didn't break me. They tried. But I held on to something. I just didn't know what it was." "You did more than hold on," Eli said. "You fought." "They wanted to bury me in silence," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I found something else in that silence." "What was that?" She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "Someone who was willing to listen." Just then, a sound drifted down into the hollow, the sound of a dislodged pebble skittering down a rock face. It was a small sound, but in the dead silence of the night, it was as loud as a gunshot. They were here. Eli was on his feet in an instant, pulling her with him toward the back of the cave. "There's another way out," he whispered. "A crawl space. It leads to the slope on the other side of the ridge." They slipped into the narrow tunnel he had dug years before. It was a tight squeeze, the rock scraping against their clothes. As they emerged onto a steep, dark slope, a gunshot cracked through the night air, the bullet ricocheting off the rock just above their heads. "Go!" Eli yelled, pushing her down the slope. "Run! I'm not leaving you!" she screamed back. "Move!" he roared, turning back toward the sound of the hunters and returning fire, his shots echoing in the confined space. He heard a man cry out in pain. The others scattered for cover. That was all the time he needed. He scrambled down the slope after Ada, catching up to her at the bottom. The southern trail was just ahead. Freedom was within their grasp. But as they burst out of the trees and onto the trail, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. Ada stopped dead, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. Eli raised his rifle, but he froze when he saw the man's face, illuminated by the moonlight. It was Paul, the man who had promised her daisies, the man who had sold her for 2 mules and a barrel of whiskey. "Ada," Paul said, his voice pleading, "I came back for you. I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake." He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "Come with me. I can protect you. They'll listen to me. I can take you away from all this." Ada stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. This man, the architect of her suffering, was standing here, offering her salvation. It was a twisted, cruel joke. "You left me to rot," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I had no choice," he pleaded. "Corbin would have killed me, but I have money now. We can disappear. Start over, just you and me, like we planned." He glanced at Eli, his expression turning to a sneer. "You don't need him. What can he offer you? A life on the run? Hiding in caves?" It was a test. A final, brutal test of who she was now. Was she still the girl who could be swayed by promises of a garden? Or was she the woman who had clawed her way back from hell? She looked at Eli, standing beside her, wounded and exhausted, but unyielding. Then she looked back at Paul. She raised her chin, and with all the strength and fury she possessed, she spat directly in his face. "I would rather die free with him than live as a queen with you," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. Paul's face contorted with rage. He lunged, not for her, but for Eli, a long knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. Eli met his charge, the two men crashing to the ground in a desperate struggle. The trackers were closing in, their shouts echoing from the rocks above. Eli was tired, his movements slow. Paul was fueled by a spurned, jealous rage. He gained the upper hand, pinning Eli to the ground, the knife raised high, glinting in the moonlight. "She was always mine," he screamed, plunging the knife downward. A deafening boom ripped through the night. Paul's body went stiff. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face. He slumped sideways, revealing Ada standing behind him, her arms outstretched, holding Eli's heavy revolver with both hands. Smoke curled from the barrel, rising into the cold night air. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then the trackers opened fire from the ridge above. Eli scrambled to his feet, grabbing Ada's hand. "This way!" They ran, not south toward Silver Ridge, but west, deeper into the treacherous, rocky heart of the canyon lands. They were cornered, exhausted, and out of ammunition. The trackers were closing in for the kill, their voices echoing in the darkness, confident and cruel. They reached the edge of a vast, deep chasm, a dead end. Below them, 100-foot drop to a rocky riverbed. Behind them, the sounds of the approaching hunters. "It's over," Ada breathed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The tracker in the gray duster stepped into the clearing, a triumphant smirk on his face. His men fanned out, their rifles leveled. "Nowhere left to run, little bird," the tracker said, savoring his victory. Eli pushed Ada behind him, shielding her with his body, his empty revolver held uselessly in his hand. He was going to die here, but he was going to die on his feet. And then, from the opposite wall of the canyon, came a sound. A high, piercing whistle, like a hawk's cry. Before the tracker could react, the air was filled with a sound like tearing cloth. A volley of arrows, silent and deadly, flew across the chasm. Two of the trackers crumpled to the ground, arrows sprouting from their chests. The others stared in confusion and terror. Figures began to emerge from the rocks on the far side of the canyon. Ghostly shapes in the moonlight, armed with bows and rifles. Apache warriors. Eli's telegraph hadn't been to a man in Santa Fe. It had been a desperate call for help, sent to the only family he had left. His people. The tracker stared in disbelief, his smug expression replaced by one of pure terror. He raised his rifle to fire at the figures, but it was too late. Another arrow, faster than a bullet, caught him in the throat. He fell without a sound. The remaining men threw down their guns and raised their hands in surrender. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over in seconds. A rope was thrown across the chasm, and a grizzled older warrior slid across with the grace of a mountain cat. He landed softly in front of Eli and clasped his shoulder. "It is good to see you, Nashan," the man said, his voice deep and warm. "Your mother would be proud." Eli, weak from exhaustion and relief, could only nod. He introduced Ada to his uncle, and they were offered safety, a place to heal among his people. But as they stood there, on the edge of the canyon, with the sunrise painting the sky behind them, Ada looked at Eli. She still had the ledger, and tucked inside it was the small, leather-bound box they had almost forgotten, the one with money and papers left by his wife, Ruth. A legacy of hope. A chance for a new beginning. They didn't have to run anymore. They could stay. They could be safe. But safety wasn't the same as freedom. Months later, A steamship pulled away from a crowded port in San Francisco, its horn bellowing as it pointed its bow toward the vast open ocean. On the deck, a man and a woman stood at the railing, watching the coastline of America shrink until it was just a thin line on the horizon. The woman had hair the color of spun gold and eyes as green as a spring meadow. She was writing in a small ledger book. The man stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his dark eyes fixed on the future. They weren't Nashan and Ada Rose anymore. Those people had died in a canyon in New Mexico. The man and woman on this boat had new names, a new life, bought with blood and courage. They had been through the fire, and like the ash that remains, they had endured. They were survivors. But more than that, they were free. They had found more than just a way out. They had found redemption, not in a place, but in each other. They had healed the wounds of the past by fighting for a future they could finally call their own. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the strongest souls are the ones that have been broken and have put themselves back together, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because true justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found at the edge of a canyon, in the heart of a survivor. Let me know in the comments what new names you think they chose for their new life. Thanks for watching.